if we take into consideration Warburg, take into consideration the political deterioration and the economic implosion of Russia, the growing momentum or what seems to be the improvement of Zelensky-Trump relations, it's all coming to a head, right? Everything's colliding. There's this compounding.
The trends are going in very clear directions on either side. It's actually it's a situation where it's almost more informative the more you zoom out, because war is hell. And so, if you look at any individual case, buildings getting blown up, a Russian ballistic missile takes out a family, and there's horrific imagery, like it can just feel hopeless. But the more you zoom out and the more you get a grasp for the big picture trend, you realize this is all going in a certain direction. And it will potentially next year be the bloodiest year of the war, potentially by far. What I do worry about isn't Ukraine losing the war when I think about what's coming next, but I worry about all those Russians who get mobilized and get killed.
This is The Global Gambit.
You're watching The Global Gambit, everyone, or just Pyotr's YouTube channel, and we're back with Paul Warburg's channel, I guess, and the Icarus Project. How's it going, mate? It's been about a month or a bit longer, I think, since we last chatted, and there's been a lot happening, obviously.
It's been a while, man. It's been busy. I feel like the war in Ukraine changes every single day now, and even I can't really keep up with everything that's going on, and I feel like that's kind of saying a lot, given this space. And then, of course, there's all these other global events that I just can't even keep up with because there's so much happening in Ukraine. So it's a busy time. How about you?
Yeah, when I started The Global Gambit, the idea was that it would be kind of global. I would talk about what I call forgotten conflicts, Sudan, Myanmar, DRC, the Sahel. But the war in Ukraine is changing so much that I don't even have time to cover sort of Iran as well, which is the other global fallout. And I think that's a good segue into really in the past 48 hours, which has been an insane, shall we say, overlap between these two fronts. I think it's pretty clear, at least from my perspective, that it's not going to go further than what we saw. The Ukrainians and Iranians have been pretty clear that they don't seek further escalation. But, maybe that I'm being too naive and just reading the news and believing it. But what's your assessment of what we saw in the past couple of days?
Yeah, I don't really know what to make of it yet as far as what's going to unfold. We have claims that this strike on this Iranian tanker this Iranian ship was an accident. I kind of find that difficult to believe, but certainly that's de-escalatory language at the same time. These conflicts in Iran and in Ukraine are intricately connected, probably more than we like to admit, because Iran for years, long before the U.S. war in Iran, was providing Russia with their Shahed drones, which have been really the number one tool that Russia has used to attack Ukrainian cities on a nightly basis. And really, if you look at it from that angle, in a lot of respects, I think Ukraine has more of a cause for a war with Iran than even the U.S. does right now. Of course, they don't want to open a second front and things of that sort because of their resources. But at the same time, the fact that they've done this strike, I think it's pretty significant. I don't think Ukraine would have even risked that a couple of years ago, but Ukraine is feeling strong right now, and rightfully so. If we look at their drone production numbers, and not just the raw numbers, but the categories of equipment that they're producing for themselves, it could be that they do feel strong enough to be in a position to try to disrupt directly these supply chains from Iran to Russia, which have been harming them so much. So, it remains to be seen what will happen. There's a lot of options here, but it's certainly something to keep our eye on.
Yeah, I made a video on it yesterday because quite a few people wanted it to sort of, because it was quite an interesting dynamic there. And one of the arguments we had from a guest we spoke to, a chap called Trita Parsi, his suggestion was that, Ukraine is trying to merge the conflicts as a way to draw the United States into the war with Putin. Now, that's an interesting analogy, but I think it's completely not nonsensical for the Ukrainians, because the likelihood that the Iranians and Russians would work together in whatever shape or form to strike back against Ukraine would be a lot more guaranteed than the United States coming to the aid of Ukraine for some reason. If they're cutting aid towards Ukraine, I don't see why they would then start using more of their depleting stockpiles, which they need for Iran, to aid Ukraine on behalf of Ukraine. Also, I doubt the security intelligence, whatever communities in the US would be like, yeah, sure, we'll work on behalf of the Ukrainians and then start striking Russia as well, because then that is a real risk of World War III. So, I mean, for me, it was sort of like, this is bad, interesting that this happened, but I don't see the two conflicts becoming intertwined. I thought that was always preposterous. So, I mean,
it's an interesting thread, and certainly it's a big topic. I saw a creator get a lot of views on a video on that topic. I actually haven't watched the video yet, to be fair. But yeah, I agree. There's a lot to unpack there. I don't know if the primary goal would be to actually directly merge the conflicts. If Ukraine is doing anything as far as the US is concerned, I'd say probably signaling. They're trying to get stuff out of the United States. They just signed a massive drone deal with the United States, which is going to be big. I think Ukraine, though, at this point, to be honest, and it's not just like hype, Ukraine doesn't really need the United States anymore. They can benefit from having the United States on their side, especially in the immediate term, if they can get their hands on Patriot missiles, which seems unlikely in the immediate term because the United States is fighting against Iran. But, we look at a couple of years ago and everybody thought Ukraine was going to lose the war because of Zelensky's spat in the White House with Trump, or rather Trump's spat in the White House with Zelensky, I should say it that way. And in all honesty, nothing really significant happened when the US cut aid from Ukraine. And Ukraine is in a much better space now than they were then. They're producing all of their own weapon systems of all of these major categories. And so there's no massive need for Ukraine to risk a war with Iran for theoretical and limited benefit from getting the United States involved in the conflict against Russia, because they already know how that's going to play out. So I completely agree with you. At the same time, striking one ship is very unlikely to lead to that outcome, especially if that's where it remains. But it is likely to do some signaling to a man like Donald Trump, like, oh, look, even Ukraine is attacking Iran. I can use that with my base to help justify this war. And maybe, Ukraine can get something from that, whether it is better terms and more deals where they're not getting stuff from the US, they're actually selling stuff to the US, or whether that's getting some Patriots. I don't know. But those seem to be like the main cards and considerations from my perspective.
Yeah, I would add just on this last point on this sort of topic is what you said just then is what I emphasized on a news segment earlier today. Ukraine is not in the same position it is 2 years ago. 2 years ago, it was wholly dependent on so much provision. And now it's the balance of power has shifted. Ukraine is the one dictating the terms, not dictating the terms, but leading the way with innovation in not just drones, but drone interceptors. Look at what it's doing with the Saudis. Look at what it's doing across the Middle East. So they don't need necessarily the United States to come to their aid. Of course, there's concerns about ability to intercept certain missile types from Moscow, but this is not the same Ukraine from 2024. And moreover, just to double down on what you sort of alluded to there, I don't understand the rationale here from anyone's side. So the Ukrainians are like, okay, we're going to hit the Iranians. That benefits us, even though we can't guarantee that it will mean the US comes in. And it assumes that the Iranians are acting irrationally because they're like, one ship. Let's attack everything Ukraine. Screw the United States. Let's go after them. Yeah, Israel's not our most enemy. It's the Ukrainians now. It doesn't make sense to me. The Iranians are methodical, strategic, long-term thinkers, I think, in this regard. Proportionality is an underlying approach to their strategy, I think.
Mm-hmm.
And lastly, it assumes rationality, just to pivot or spin around, from Donald Trump, which there isn't any. So I got a bit animated there, but it's just this is why I think this is the difference between people on the internet who just spout anything for views, people who just say stuff, Ukraine, Iran, World War III now, to no, because if you actually think about it, it's not going to happen. No, it's not as interesting and won't get the views. Maybe it does, I don't know. This doesn't make sense to me. So no, I think we've largely seen an end to that theatre for now. But who's to say? Maybe things will crop up. But certainly for Putin, it's a difficult time. Like the other thing, obviously, in the past 24 hours, we've had Zelensky at the White House. So I was pretty keen to hear your perspective on Zelensky's appearance, his approach to dealing with Trump this time, how their relationship is. What's your thoughts?
So I haven't had a chance to do a full debrief on what actually happened, but it was a rather short conversation. I mean, it was only an hour, and that's really short to cover all of the things that they would potentially need to cover. And so I don't know how substantive this meeting actually was or what was accomplished, or if it was more, not just for show, but I don't know what the word I'm looking for here. For lack of a better word, it's just for show, but not quite that strong. But there is a difference in the relationship and the demeanor now versus what we saw in the past. Notable of this meeting was who was not there, which was JD Vance. No, I don't know if we can read too much into that. Maybe he's just busy or something. But certainly that was a big reason for the blow up that we saw last time. And it was, in my opinion, probably pretty clearly pre-orchestrated, with Vance kind of serving as the antagonizer. And he was notably absent from the meeting this time. So it shows a different posture of the U.S. towards Ukraine, for whatever that's worth. That doesn't necessarily mean anything in practice. It just means that, a couple of years ago, people were skeptical about if Ukraine would even survive as a country. And now pretty much everybody's agreeing that Ukraine has the upper hand. Not everybody's saying outright that they're going to win, but it's a pretty dumb position to act like Ukraine is somehow losing. And so the U.S. has at least been forced to change their posture there. I think most interesting, though, is the fact that the U.S. is now at war. And now that they're at war, they're finding that they increasingly need specifically the things that Ukraine has. And honestly, the positions have kind of inverted. It's not a complete inversion because Ukraine still needs some things the U.S. has, but again, not that many. So it's not a one-sided relationship, but in a lot of ways it's inverted, where the U.S. had this strong hand against Ukraine. We acted like they needed us to survive against Russia, even though we weren't even really giving them anything. And now we increasingly recognize, for the warfare of the future, the U.S. in its current state is pretty screwed if we don't adapt and if we don't learn from Ukraine. A couple other angles to this, just to back that up. When we see Ukraine in dealings with other countries, for example, with Poland, we see these countries want something in particular, and it's the same thing the United States wants, which is Ukraine's drone technology. And not just the tech of the physical drones themselves, but the data and the software and the training methodologies that go with it. And so we see Poland, for example, holding back their MiG fighter jets from Ukraine because Ukraine isn't giving them what they want on the drone front. It just shows that Ukraine really has a lot of leverage over other countries right now, and that's the same over the United States. And I think at this current moment, that is probably the dominant theme of any conversations that we're having. How can Ukraine support U.S. war efforts in Iran with technology, and how can Ukraine ensure that the U.S. military doesn't fall too behind?
Yeah, it's a bit of a double-edged sword, I think, in that on the one hand, Ukraine has all this leverage and therefore can persuade, not coerce, but persuade more, incentivize other actors to cooperate more. But on the other hand, if so many other countries recognize that Ukraine is so valuable that they can sort of be like, well, we will withhold, because the thing is, Ukraine is still a sole actor versus a collective group, and the on and off tensions with Poland at random times is, I think, illustrative of that. But certainly the Americans right now, with the loss of stockpiles, the ammunition concerns, whatever, arsenal stockpile replenishment rather, is a lingering issue for Washington. And the nature of warfare, as we cover a lot on the show and you talk about, is rapidly changing. A demonstration that middle powers, if you like, or smaller regional players can really be an obstruction to the great powers, quote unquote, big player, be that Ukraine with Moscow or Iran with DC, and all about this agility, the mobility, the asymmetry, whatever buzzword you want to use. I think it's very indicative of that, and certainly I don't know how much the Ukrainians can still. I think it's more a case of America has the absolute brokerage here, right? Ukraine has its relativism in its comparative advantages, but certainly America still has that capacity to put pressure on Europe. If Trump gets fed up with Europe for whatever reason and threatens surveillance reduction, because that's the biggest Achilles heel I think Europe has, is surveillance. means, then that would obviously mean concerns for Europe. And it's a trickle-down effect. If the Europeans can't sustain their own support to Ukraine because they have to focus on filling their own shortcomings because of the United States, then it kind of still leads back to Ukraine a little bit. But for the time being, it seems things are relatively on the up. I'm not going to get too carried away and say that the Zelensky-Trump relationship is good, but he did call him his friend for what it's worth. And for all intents and purposes, at the end of the day, Trump likes winners. And I think that's what it boils down to, is that Ukraine is winning. The momentum is with Ukraine right now with these wildberry blasts and refinery attacks. It's remarkable. And certainly, therefore, Trump wants to be on the side of the winner. Maybe, have you got any other thoughts on that? Is there anything I'm missing?
I mean, totally. And, it's well and good to focus on, for example, how much Europe needs the United States, because it's true, we have some capabilities that Europe doesn't have. But I think the United States, and frankly, even the Trump administration, as hard as this might be to believe, is increasingly recognizing our vulnerability in this new age of warfare. Because our military, it is the most powerful in the world. But we're realizing actually how weak it is because of some particular weaknesses. And the main weakness is cost and production timelines. So the US military, we're really good at producing systems that can do everything. Like, that's the Patriot missile. It's just phenomenally good at like every interception job. It's really expensive because of that. And because of that, and because it's expensive and so complex, we cannot produce enough of them quick enough. And now we see Ukraine building an alternative to that system, even with their Freya missile system. It's not just Ukraine, they're building it in partnership with Europe. And this is a missile that's designed to do the same job as the Patriot for Ukraine, but it's not designed to do every single job. So it's like specifically designed for the purpose of addressing their biggest weakness, which is, I would argue, the United States' biggest weakness, because we have the same shortages, which are ballistic missile attacks. And they're going to be able to produce a lot more of these at a lower cost. And that's critical, for example, for the United States if we enter into a potential conflict with China. Not that I'm saying that I think that's likely, but this is how the calculus works. We're really vulnerable right now. And so Ukraine increasingly is the master of technologies, and not just the technologies, because technology is great, but the actual understanding of how to use those technologies in a combat scenario. And the US is increasingly recognizing that we need to lean on that expertise. And as an American, I'm grateful for that. I wish it came with more humility at the forefront, because we caused a lot of damage we didn't need to cause. But the good thing is, I think by causing that damage, is we did push the Ukrainians and the Europeans to start developing capabilities on their own. And now, even though for years we've been, at least Trump has been talking about how much we don't need NATO and how Europe's freeloaders, maybe there was a little bit of truth to that, but there's a certain way to approach things that you don't have to be a jerk all the time to get things done. Now we're realizing that we actually need these guys and their capabilities.
Yeah, and I think what's interesting to that is the specific idea of NATO minors, just to put a clear badge on it. Some of my viewers have emphasized the capacity for Ukraine to be the biggest force in NATO, so to speak, instead of the United States. And in many ways, maybe not in spending power, but in military innovation and leadership, that there is that argument to be made. The United States doesn't necessarily have to be in NATO for it to still function so much. NATO without the US is still $400 billion. That's a lot of money. It's more than Russia and China combined. So I think there is that potency there. But I don't think the US will leave NATO. I think Trump still sees the value in it, even if he kicks it all the time. But I just wonder about the time horizon of this for sort of over the winter. I think the biggest concerns remain sometimes how well can Ukraine manage during the fall and winter months. Now, the past one was the toughest for sure, but we're in the height of summer now. August is often a interesting month where we've seen a counteroffensive, we've seen effective mobilizations. There's rumors of those happening with Putin now. Maybe he'll wait till after these Duma elections or whatever's coming up. What do you think is on the horizon potentially for Ukraine or Russia?
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack there. So let me focus on the immediate term, which is really ballistic missiles, and then we'll talk about the mobilization. So we talk about this winter, and the reality is, this is war, and it's probably going to be a rough winter for Ukraine. Russia in the past, they've always targeted Ukrainian energy infrastructure. They're trying to freeze the Ukrainians out, much like they thought they would freeze the Europeans out at the start of the war by withholding their gas from them, things of that sort. But I don't think that it will be nearly enough to break the Ukrainians. I recently did a video, and I can't remember the specific figure off the top of my head, but I basically was like, let's assume, Russia's best case rate of ballistic missile production. Let's assume they launch every one of those missiles, everyone is successful, every one of them hits a Ukrainian target with absolutely zero of them being intercepted. What's the worst case that Russia could do in terms of that damage? And it's significant, but it wasn't nearly as bad as I would have thought. If I recall correctly, I think it was something like, at their worst, which is an completely unrealistic scenario, Russia could damage, not destroy, but damage the equivalent of 1% of the apartment buildings in Ukraine. And keep in mind, it wouldn't all be apartment buildings because it's distributed, but it just helps you see. And in terms of damage, we see the worst strikes, and there are some terrible strikes where entire buildings are destroyed and things of that sort. But typically, that's not the case. Typically, you might see one or two or a couple of different floors destroyed, but the building can still go on. So this is real damage, but it's also, in terms of warfare, in terms of trying to subdue an entire nation into submission, not nearly significant enough. And again, that's the worst case scenario. In reality, we have been seeing interception rates increasing. Ukraine has been doing really well. There's a big hoopla a couple weeks ago about how Ukraine was out of interceptors and they couldn't do this anymore. And I had a hypothesis that I think has been proven true, which was that, Ukraine wasn't doing quite all it could in terms of interception. They do have limited interceptors, but they were strategically not using the interceptors as much as they could have at that specific time because they needed people to recognize the potential weight of that problem as they went into this NATO summit to get deals to help fix the problem in the long term, which is precisely what happened. And now that that's over, we've seen interception rates kick back up. And so Ukraine is doing a lot better, than headlines would have projected a couple weeks ago. And at the same time, Ukraine is also actively attacking the facilities that produce the ballistic missiles, which is basically the only thing they cannot consistently intercept. And so we see, that worst case scenario, maybe we cut it by at least a third 2 different times, because I would guess Ukraine over the long term could cut at least a third of Russian ballistic missile production. We see how impressive their strikes against Russia are right now. And I would guess that with, the short to medium term solutions they're implementing to get more interceptor capabilities today, they could also at least offset maybe a third of what Russia can throw at them. And so the worst case scenario just gets divided down. It's not precise, but you get the picture. It'll be bad for Ukraine, but they'll survive the winter as they always have. And so that's one big topic. That's leading up to Russia getting men mobilized for battle, which is the big thing everybody's worried about. Russia, as far as the rumors, I guess I won't call them really rumors at this point. It's almost confirmed, but it seems like Russia is going to mobilize up to 500,000 people. It seems to be the best number that people keep landing on. And people are afraid because, it's a big number. But I don't think this is going to significantly help the Russians. Because again, you have to look at this in context. So we can look at, Russia can mobilize for certain positions, which are the positions where they lose soldiers all the time. And so they need to replace those losses. But those soldiers haven't really accomplished anything. Yes, I know that there are cities that fall to the Russians on a somewhat regular basis, like 1 or 2 cities a year. It's not a dramatic push. And this is at massive losses. These people aren't really accomplishing anything. But the men who are accomplishing things in the Russian military, the drone pilots, the same as in Ukraine, the ones who allow the infantry to be successful as far as they can be, and the ones who also hold Ukraine back from making advances of their own. These numbers are drastically diminishing, and you cannot just simply mobilize people effectively into those positions. You can put people in those positions. It doesn't mean they're going to be good. And we can see that because Russia, to fill these forces, they've had a different recruitment campaign than they've had anywhere else. So for their unmanned systems forces, they haven't been, deceiving people with high-paying contracts and forcing them into that to fill the numbers. They've actually been trying to fill these ranks with competent people where they're recruiting at universities, trying to get young people into the positions. And they're being woefully unsuccessful. I think their goal was 78,800 by the end of the year. As of the 6-month target, they had 8,000. And so they're like on pace for 16,000 out of 78,800 by the end of the year. That is a drastic shortfall of the one capability that actually allows the Russians to accomplish things and prevents the Ukrainians from accomplishing things. It's huge. And conscription isn't going to solve that. And so as Russia throws more bodies at the problem, literally, it's unclear that they'll actually make any gains, but the parts of the military that are responsible for their successes as much as they are, those are diminishing. At the same time, we see the strikes on the Wildberries facilities. We see Ukraine, I would argue, softening up Belgorod, clearing it out before forces can concentrate there and potentially open up a front on Kharkiv. Any potential Russian mobilization is being drastically diminished before it even happens. So even the infantry troops themselves will be drastically limited because, again, a human body isn't such a great weapon if it can't actually get to a location in the first place for lack of fuel. And when it gets there, it doesn't have equipment to actually do the job. So those are, my thoughts. That was a lot. So I'll pause and I'll let you respond to that.
Well, I mean, you certainly made the point that I made a lot in my sort of outlay of those points, and so you did a thorough good job of outdoing me in how many points you actually made there. No, it was very extensive. I would simply say I think it comes down to a simple dichotomy for Putin. He can't call a mobilization because then he has to admit that the war is not going to plan. Sorry, the SMO. But he can't not call because he will then have a frontline problem. So the guy is in a genuine predicament. What does he do? Either way, it's going to be a huge risk. And no amount of these sizable bonus checks, signing checks, whatever. I think a friend of mine in one oblast has said that, they're going for about $150,000. $150,000. The Russian state does not have this kind of money. Some people argue that their gold reserves have dropped by 2/3 more, significantly redistributing. You've got capital flight, the loss of money being pulled out of the economy, not by the average person, although that is happening, but by the billionaires. And we've got the nationalization of private companies from former billionaires, oligarchs. The state is in a significant setback. And this is all without talking about the political climate for Putin. The Slaviki is not in a great shape. He's got more security personnel, more money seems to go on his own security, personal security, than it does his actual government and stuff. And then, of course, the front lines. I mean, you cannot replace. Well, manpower, some people argue drones could be sufficient to replace manpower. I'm not so sure about that. But the point is that if you have plenty of manpower, then they are sitting ducks for drones. And we've seen plenty of videos of very arbitrary, simplistic ways the Russians have been trying to intercept or deal with drones. I saw a pretty crude one just a couple of days back of them on the back of a pickup or something, a BTR maybe, racing down somewhere in the territories, and they just shot at the drone with a shotgun. And that seemed to do the trick. But then another one came from another angle, and the necessary happened. So that's the element. The Russians are innovative. I think we shouldn't deny that. But they have a problem with the rate at which the Ukrainians are able to deal with this. And so you're seeing, I don't know if you've seen this news as well, Paul, but the idea of 30,000 troops coming from North Korea. That's great. The world's second largest standing army, or is it the largest standing army after China's? I can't remember in terms of troop numbers. 30,000 is not many for the North Koreans. So if the DPRK is able to provide these quantities of troops, now we don't know how good they are at fighting, probably not very well. But from the last time that they were in Kursk a couple of years ago, they barely spoke Russian. The horizontal communication, the command and control was terrible, as we saw. Putin is in a real sticky wicket, to use a British phrase. So, yeah, I think it's a compounding effect, right? I'll pass it back to you. But, if we take into consideration Wildberries, take into consideration the political deterioration and the economic implosion of Russia, the growing momentum, or what seems to be the improvement of Zelensky-Trump relations, it's all coming to a head, right? Everything's colliding. There's this compounding effect, I think, is the main thing for me right now.
Yeah, I mean, the trend, as you just laid out, the trends are going in very clear directions on either side. And that it's actually it's a situation where it's almost more informative the more you zoom out, because war is hell. And so, if you look at any individual case, it can just be devastating. Like you see headlines in Ukraine of buildings getting blown up, a Russian ballistic missile takes out a family, and there's horrific imagery. Like it can just feel hopeless. But the more you zoom out and the more you get a grasp for the big picture trend, you realize this is all going in a certain direction, and it will potentially next year be the bloodiest year of the war, potentially by far. What I do worry about isn't Ukraine losing the war when I think about what's coming next, but I worry about all those Russians who get mobilized and get killed. I feel for the Russians, especially those who have actually managed to spend 4 years not being convinced to join the Russian military, which are those who would be mobilized, right? You're, by definition, taking people who don't want to go, and that's why you're using this tactic. They've been offered huge sums of money, and they've chosen not to do it. In a lot of ways, they're kind of powerless to stop the situation, at least as individuals. You could argue, maybe collectively they should do something. And I agree eventually it'll get there, but at the same time, like I don't want to see, people who were just happened to be born on the wrong side of a border end up dying for no reason. And I'm not, of course, Ukraine is well within their rights. This is war. Ukraine is well within their rights to defeat this force if it's accumulated. But it's going to be a grim year, and I don't want to be negative Nelly about that. But that's like where my mind goes when I think about negatives of this war. I no longer worry about the geopolitics and the strategy and the long-term consequences for democracy. Like, for me, it feels kind of like a done deal. Ukraine's going to win. And in a lot of ways, democracies have distributed their power more evenly, where it's not so concentrated just in the hands of the United States. All in all, there was a lot of things that have happened and been a lot of fears, but I think they're all going to end up in a good way. But I think it's going to be kind of grim what we see over the next year.
No, I think it's very true. It's important not to forget the humanistic side of this. I hosted Tim Mack, who does a fantastic Substack and set of stories about the human stories of those on the ground in Ukraine and afflicted by the war. He's done stories of Russians who fled as well. So he tries to be, I think, all encompassing like that. And I think it's important not to lose the forest for the trees in that regard. We could get wrapped up in sort of the latest headline, but ultimately this is still about the lives of people. And certainly I think, the Ukrainian side, I think that a lot of Ukrainians seek punishment for Russians and Moscow and such, but they don't necessarily want the same to be felt by them as what they've gone through. Sort of, I don't think there is necessarily amongst many of them that sort of desire, because at the end of the day, the war is hell, and it's not going to end by causing such destruction elsewhere. And I think that's kind of indicative to the way that Ukraine conducts its strikes, right? They don't just target civilian infrastructure; they target sites that have a relationship to the war, conflict, the law of armed conflict rules, right? Rules of engagement, ROE. And certainly at the end of the day, this war could just end if Putin left Ukraine. That's something that people constantly sort of seem to forget. And have to end this way if Putin is ousted or just wakes up. Not that that's ever going to happen, unfortunately, and he just left, So, it's a pretty tough one. But I was quite interested to sort of maybe pivot a little bit to Crimea, because that's obviously a particularly volatile area. It has symbolism for both sides in a unique way. But it's also seen some of the most intense fighting operations changes. And I'm really interested to hear your breakdown, because you've done quite a lot of targeted coverage whilst I've only touched upon it. So, in the time that we've spoken, how much a change has there been?
Well, I don't think we've spoken since the siege of Crimea started. So there's been a big change.
I thought you were getting ready to say, oh God, he's asked a massive question again.
This is a fascinating topic, but I also think most people know most of the details, so I'll cover it quickly. Ukraine is sieging Crimea. I started talking about this. It's one of the first things I started talking about when I started my YouTube channel. It would have been like 2 years ago. And at that time, I was told this would never happen. It's insane. This is propaganda. Like, what drugs am I on? But my thesis was watching the trajectory of drone warfare and watching what Ukraine had already done to the Black Sea Fleet. And I said, look, Ukraine, with more time and more advances, can cut off Crimea from supplies, can cause Russian citizens to flee from Crimea over the Kerch Strait Bridge, which does them a big humanitarian favor as Ukraine, because it means that they can take back Crimea without having to, be an occupying force with millions of citizens there who don't want to submit to your government, that sort of thing. And it's happening. And it's not only happening, like, it's been more dramatic than I ever thought it would be in terms of the speed at which it's happening, the scale at which it's happening, the confidence with which it's happening. I don't know if you saw the interview with Magyar, which is the Ukrainian, drone commander who's responsible for the campaign. His language, I mean, people should watch the interview. It's incredibly confident. Like, this is a done deal. And that's not typical language that we see from the Ukrainian military in the past. They've been very hesitant to make strong statements and predictions because they, I think, knew how precarious the situation was. There's a lot of confidence. And so strategically speaking, Crimea, it's done for the Russians. Crimea is only a cost. There's no benefit to the Russians for fighting for Crimea other than, saving ego, and Putin's ego specifically. And now we see that campaign has not just happened to Crimea, but again, over and above my expectations, which I was told I was insane for thinking they'd even happen the way I thought they would. Now Ukraine has taken over essentially the Sea of Azov, and they're in the process of taking over the entire Black Sea, not just from a military standpoint, they did that a long time ago, but from a shipping standpoint. There's a whole nother topic there with the grain trade. I won't get into that, but it's pretty crazy what's happening there. And it shows us how Ukraine can win this war, which is not fighting the same way the Russians do, but using modern technology and geography in their favor, which is how really all wars have always been won, using modern technology, modern to whatever age it is, that your opponents aren't using. Find advantages and use the terrain to your advantage. And we now even see the first in history, successful amphibious drone landings having been conducted by Ukraine. Now, it's just one that's happened so far. It's just an initial proof of concept, but it went really well. And I'll remind people that a couple of years ago, we were seeing drones dropping munitions on soldiers as a very first in modern warfare. And we've already come this far in about 4 years. Again, if you watch the interview with Magyar, the leader of Ukraine's drone forces, it's pretty fascinating. Honestly, like, stunning to me to realize the scale at which drone warfare has advanced, because he talks about the early days when the Ukrainians were just figuring it out and like strapping grenades to drones and dropping them on individual soldiers. And so my point in bringing all that up is, with these advances, when the ground robotics and the amphibious landings and that technology scales up, Ukraine really can take back Crimea without a massive human invasion. It's crazy.
Yeah, I've been criticized plenty of times. Gosh, if we go back the first few days of the war, or we go back even a couple of days ago, and saying the propaganda, I actually had to delete someone who I was going to host a couple of weeks from now because they thought I was saying such propaganda. But we'll save that for another time as well. No, I mean, I've been to Crimea when I was 10. I remember vividly. It was the first place I ever had the confidence to swim underwater. We were walking along the beach, and obviously this was when things were more reasonable. So this was 2003. I'd stayed with a friend in eastern Ukraine, and then we'd gone down to Crimea. I met my father, who'd come from Russia after he'd been seeing his family, and we were walking along the beach, and I just had this confidence to dive into the water. But we were nearby Sevastopol, which is where I'm going with this story, which is that Sevastopol has obviously been at the heart of Russia's entire naval strategy. Russia's not really known as a maritime force, but certainly it's been crucial. And the fact that Ukraine are so confident about this, as you say, I think demonstrates just how big a loss and systemically redefining it will be for Moscow, for Russia, in its near abroad, in its sphere of influence. And yeah, I mean, the fact that the Ukrainians, it kind of goes back to what I said at the beginning of our conversation, right? the arc by which the beginning point where Ukraine was barely able to function or be supported without the need of the United States, to now the confidence from the generals and the military staff able to say, we're going to take back Crimea. It's just a matter of when. It's idiotic why the Russians still holding it, or why the Russians still trying to hold it. Like, leave, guys. Like, save yourselves, sort of thing. So no, the confidence there, and it's that inner confidence. It's not like bravado, like we will do this. It's very much we got this. I don't need to tell you too much. Is this interview done? I need to get on with the job, sort of thing, right? So I think Crimea is the encapsulation of just how much Ukraine has turned the tables. The balance of power has shifted. And why there's so much, I think also for people watching, there's quite a big emphasis. People often bring up to me just about Crimea. The front lines are important. Russia's economy is a particular facet which people are very interested in. But from a military standpoint, it always seems to be just specifically what's going on with Crimea, which is because I think it gives that real sense of momentum and the greatest amount of like, wow, Ukraine really does have this. So it's going to be crazy to see what happens in the next few months. I think the fall is particularly pivotal for these sorts of things. I think you can see quite a big shift in the past few years. The winter's quite slow. Surprisingly, the summer is overhyped. I think spring and autumn, when the biggest seasonal changes occur, is when I think the biggest attempts at grabbing an advantage or a shift in momentum or something like that it can often happen. But sort of, I guess I put that to you, and then maybe we can reconvene in August or something. What do you think people should keep a watch out for? What would you mainly be looking at in the next couple of weeks?
Well, you just said it, and I think an important thing to point out for this year is, like you just mentioned, all those trends for the seasons. This year, there's a very real chance that could be inverted. The winter is typically slow because it's hard to do assaults in the winter, right? It's cold, just frankly. But in increasing numbers, Ukraine is expanding their ground drone forces. And robots, they have to deal with the cold too, but not to the same degree as humans. And so there's a lot of potentials for what could happen. In the winter, when human soldiers are at a disadvantage, Ukraine might try something with their ground drones that we've never seen the likes of ever before. There's not a lot of advertisement around that. I think for obvious reasons, they're not trying to get the Russians ready for that. But all the pieces are potentially in place. And if I were a Russian, I'd be terrified of that. Ukraine right now, across the board, currently is in the process of doing everything they can to prepare for Russian mobilization, which they pretty clearly see as inevitable, which even if it's not, that's just good strategy, prepare for the worst case scenario. And so we'll see, I think more strikes of places like Belgorod and border cities, which could become Crimea 2.0, not to the same extent. It's not possible because it's not, essentially an island or a peninsula that's very close to an island. But, we'll see to a large degree a lot of border areas being cleared out by Ukraine, infrastructure annihilated, Russia's economy is still being attacked. And so they're trying to weaken Russia as much as possible before Russia makes its final push. And then eventually Russia will make that push. And then we'll see what happens from there. But I have every confidence that Ukraine knows exactly what they're doing. They have been preparing for years to do the things they're doing now. And we've seen the trajectory, and we were confident even when all we saw was a trajectory. And now today, we don't just see the trajectory, we see the actual outcomes on the battlefield beginning. Mm-hmm. And I would tell people, this is still part of the trajectory. It's an exponential curve. When you look at Ukraine's drone production numbers, it's astonishing. I don't remember the year by year, but in the span of 4 years, they've gone from producing under 10,000 drones a year to where next year they're going to be producing 10 million, or maybe it's 20, maybe it's this year's 10 million, next year's 20 million. The point is, it's a massively exponential trajectory. So everything we're seeing right now, it's not like Ukraine is using up stockpiles that, are going away. Ukraine is using just the tip of what's coming off the manufacturing line, and that arsenal of what they're capable of using is growing every single day. So it's going to get better from here for the Ukrainians.
Yeah, it's going to get better here for the Ukrainians and a lot worse for Putin and the Kremlin. Everything you said there, I would also just add that the economy of Russia, which is what we do cover quite a lot, I do want to say one thing, which is that a friend of the channel, fellow YouTuber Konstantin Somaliyov of Inside Russia, was recently attemptedly targeted by some assets of Putin's, should we put it that way. He's been in hospital, but we are going to have a chat with him in the next couple of days to see how he's doing. And we often do a regular economics dive with him. And so I'm looking forward to that. But yeah, I think the economy is the other core determinant in this, as well as the Ukrainian drone and military output, which is just insane. But also, as is insane, their impact of that on the Russian economy and the fact that Russia has to import energy from India. Like, what is going on?
and notably, to your point, there's a big milestone that I didn't even mention, but Russia just canceled bond sales because nobody is buying their bonds, which means their government has lost its only lever to spend money that they don't have. They cannot raise more debt, or they're very much struggling to do so. That's massive. It deserves a whole video on its own, and I will do one, but I just wanted to throw that in there.
Oh, you've just ruined the surprise I was going to be doing over the weekend.
Oh, yeah. All right, let's race, man. Who gets it out first?
All right, Mel, everyone. But, if you don't know Paul, of course you know Paul Warburg. It's been an absolute pleasure, my friend. Let's do this again very soon. Let me know in the comments, guys. Let us know when you want to do it again. And of course, what you want to see from us, and any other thoughts you've had, anything we missed. And of course, check out Paul's fantastic work over on his channel and the Icarus Project. And we'll see you all very soon. Thanks for watching. Take care.